A Second Chance at Love. Previous episodes are available in playlist. A link is given in the video description. Episode 5. Meanwhile, everyone in Pearson Group had been working non-stop because of the virus. Aubrey had been hanging around in the technical department. Every now and then, she would spew some insults. "Mr. Pearson!" Charles's voice rang out beside her ears. Hearing that, Aubrey quickly composed herself and lowered her eyes. "Dad, why are you here?" she greeted the person who had just entered. Samuel Pearson had a serious look on his square face. "What's going on? Are you guys still not done with the virus?" The manager of the technical department, who had been scolded by Aubrey the entire morning, was drenched in a cold sweat. He nodded while bending over, apologizing. "Mr. Pearson, we've really done our best, but this virus is just too powerful. Every time we're close to cracking it, another difficult problem will appear. It's like a never-ending, so you're saying you can't solve it?" Samuel questioned, frowning. The manager nodded guiltily. Samuel roared. He then turned around to look at his daughter. "In that case, we can only contact Lucian's company right away and ask if they have any solutions." Farwell Group had many talented employees, and their network system was the best in the world. On top of that, they had the world's second-best computer genius working for them. If Farwell Group, too, could not solve Pearson Group's problem, then the company was done for. No way. Aubrey rejected it instantly and glanced at the image on the screen with a scowl. "If we get someone from Farwell Group to solve this, then Lucian will definitely see this. I'd be utterly humiliated if that happened." Samuel lectured coldly, "If you're worried about being humiliated, then why did you mess with people without knowing their background? And now, they're getting back at you. Do you know how much our company will lose if this isn't dealt with right now? Which one is more important now? Your reputation or the company?" Aubrey bit her lip. In the end, she had no choice but to give in. Samuel shot her a glare and dialed Lucian's number, asking the latter to send some men over to solve the problem. Upon receiving the news, Lucian merely asked Caden to pick someone randomly from the technical department and send him to Pearson Group. The employee sent by Lucian was clearly more skilled than the ones at Pearson Group. The employees of Pearson Group were powerless against the virus for the entire morning, yet Lucian's employee took only one glance before he started tapping away on the keyboard. Those who were in the same industry could easily see that the virus had almost been cracked by Farwell Group's employee. Meanwhile, Roxanne returned to the study after making sure that Archie and Benny were fine. Archie returned his gaze to the laptop screen and studied the stock prices. After he studied it for some time, a series of codes appeared on the screen. "Benny, look!" Archie immediately called out to Benny. Benny's eyes lit up when he saw the codes that popped on the screen. It was a program he had designed. When someone had cracked the core sequence of the virus, the window would automatically pop up. "I thought this virus wouldn't be cracked today. Looks like the other party is a professional." Benny got more excited at that thought. He took the laptop from Archie and started tapping away on the keyboard, battling against the person on the other side. Half an hour later, Benny stopped typing. "What is it?" Archie asked in puzzlement. Benny smiled excitedly. It's been croaked. Hearing that, Archie looked at his brother strangely. Why are you still smiling so happily? Benny nodded indifferently. That person is really incredible. That fight with him just now was quite interesting. But I'm sure he's not from Pearson Group. He's way stronger than those. Though Archie was not as skilled as Benny in terms of technology, he understood what was going on. Pearson Group made zero progress the entire morning. Now that Benny has lost all of a sudden, surely the opponent is an expert, and they are not someone from Pearson Group. The whole morning should be enough for Pearson Group to seek help from someone else. It might be someone from Farwell Group. That was the only possible answer Archie could think of. Farwell Group's technical team is well known for being excellent at their job. Besides, if that woman is really Essie's mommy, there's no reason for Pearson Group not to get help from Farwell Group. Upon hearing that, Benny frowned and pursed his lips. He was furious. Though he knew that the woman was Estella's mother, she was also the woman who bullied his mother. He could not believe that Lucian had helped Aubrey. No way. I must teach them a lesson. At that thought, Benny picked up the laptop again, looking serious, his fingers gliding across the keyboard. At the same time, the employees of the technical department of Pearson Group stood at their supervisor's workstation and watched the genius at work. All they saw were the series of codes constantly appearing on the screen. It did not take long for the cartoon on the computer screens to disappear one by one. "SCIEE, is it done?" Aubrey stood up excitedly. The moment she wanted to thank her savior, the latter's expression stiffened. Aubrey's heart, too, sank instantly. "It is, supposedly." But, the person frowned, and he watched a code appearing automatically on the screen. It was simpler than the virus earlier. Vast SIA row of words appeared, which read, "Are you from Farwell Group? The hacker is actually talking to me." The employee hesitated for a moment before replying, "Yes." A series of codes appeared on the screen again. It wrote, "How dare you help that evil woman? I'm angry now." Immediately after that, the conversation on the screen disappeared and was replaced by an attack more complicated than the virus just now. What's going on? Who exactly is this? Aubrey's face turned purple with rage after she read their conversation. Caught off guard by the attack, the employee ignored her and started battling the hacker. However, he could not help but feel that something was off with the conversation earlier. The hacker has incredible skills, but they sounded a little childish. In the afternoon, seeing that the person he sent had yet to return to the company, Caden asked hesitantly, "Mr. Farwell, the person we sent to Pearson Group isn't back yet. Should we send another person over?" "We'll wait for the people from Pearson Group to come to us first," Lucian said calmly. So after all, every time Pearson Group made a request would mean that they owed Lucian a favor. Caden hummed in response and changed the topic. "The executive meeting the afternoon will be starting in 10 minutes. Would you like to go over now?" Lucian nodded and went to the conference room, with Caden following closely behind him. Along the way, Caden noticed Lucian occasionally taking his phone out to glance at it. DCCC. In fact, Lucian, who rarely placed his phone beside him during meetings, had been glancing at his phone from the corner of his eye during the meeting. Caden was perplexed, but he held back his curiosity until the meeting ended. Mr. Farwell, do you have anything important happening today? He asked cautiously. As soon as he finished his sentence, he saw Lucian furrow his brows and look rather annoyed. No, Lucian answered coldly. He whipped out his phone and glanced at the screen again. Still, there were no incoming calls. Seeing that, Lucian put his phone away, his heart filled with displeasure. I've instructed the kindergarten to expel the 2 children. That woman should have known about the news today, but why is she not doing anything? Lucian waited until the evening. Yet, he did not receive any calls from Roxanne. He suppressed his displeasure and rushed to the kindergarten to pick Estella up. I should be able to find out what's going on once I'm at the kindergarten. By the time he arrived, most of the children had left. Lucian spotted his daughter standing in the corner at a glance. She was hanging her head low and holding her school bag with both hands, looking utterly dispirited. Lucian frowned slightly and went forward to pat her head. Why are you upset? Is it because I'm late? I'm so. Before he could finish, Estella pursed her lips and snorted, walking straight past him. Lucian's hand hung in the air, and his voice stopped abruptly as he turned around helplessly to watch his daughter reach the car. He watched her climb into the car before retracting his gaze and scanning the remaining children. Even so, there were no signs of the twins. Mr. Farwell, one teacher noticed he seemed to be looking for someone. Her heart skipped a beat, and she hurried over cautiously. Lucian shifted his gaze and stared at the person in front of him expressionlessly. Where are the twins? Have they been expelled? The teacher lowered her head guiltily. Not yet. I wanted to tell them about the news when they came to school. But Ms. Jarvis called me this morning, saying the boys were feeling unwell, so I didn't get to tell. Okay, Lucian said curtly and strode to the car without waiting for the teacher to react. In the car, Estella hugged her school bag and rested her head on it, her eyes downcast. She looked as if she was pondering something. Seeing Lucian entering the car, she scooted to the side without lifting her head, putting a distance between them. Lucian sat beside her and instructed the driver to drive. After that, he gave her a concerned look, asking, "Can you tell me why you are angry today?" Estella turned her head to one side upon hearing his voice, looking completely reluctant to communicate with him. Lucian understood the signs right away. I'm the culprit for making her angry again. As for the reason, he had a rough guess, but he had no intentions of solving it at that moment unless Roxanne contacted him personally. Despite that, Estella clearly wanted him to bring up the topic. She made some gestures during the journey home, wanting to attract his attention. However, Lucian feigned ignorance. Upon reaching home, a red-eyed Estella shot him a glare before storming back to her room and slamming the door shut. She locked the door from the inside. Catalina, who was watching the pair's Cold War from downstairs, cast Lucian a concerned gaze. Mr. Farwell, what's wrong with let her be? Lucian knitted his brows. She'll be fine after a while. Catalina had no choice but to ignore the matter. However, when it was time for dinner, Estella still did not go downstairs. Catalina looked at Lucian, who sat at the dining table without digging in. She sighed inwardly and rushed upstairs to bring Estella down. Unfortunately, no one came to open the door after she knocked on it for some time. Ms. Estella, please come down to have. Before she could finish her words, a muffled sound could suddenly be heard. It sounded as if something had collapsed to the floor. Catalina's heart sank. Lucian frowned. He never thought the child would be so mad. After listening to Catalina, he nodded and went forward to knock on the door. Essie, open the door. Daddy wants to speak to you. When he finished, a muffled thump sounded on the door. Clearly, Estella was throwing something against the door to show her rejection of him. Lucian froze momentarily. He spoke once again in a gentler tone. What do you want me to do? Can you open the door and tell me? We'll talk about it, okay? A faint thump sounded on the door again. It was also Catalina's first time witnessing Estella acting that way. The thought of the latter's condition caused a fear to rise in Catalina's heart. Worried that something might happen to Estella, she said hurriedly, Mr. Farwell, I think we should just go in. I'm worried Ms. Estella might. Lucian hesitated for a moment, but he nodded in agreement. Soon, Catalina brought a spare key, opened the door, and they entered the room. They were instantly taken aback by the mess inside. The dolls Estella always treasured were scattered all over the floor. There were also a few exquisite-looking music boxes by the door, and 2 of them had cracks on them. Evidently, the items that were thrown at the door were the 2 music boxes. Among the mess was Estella curled in the corner. She was staring blankly at the ground as tears streamed down her cheeks uncontrollably. Sitting beside her were 2 relatively ugly dolls the adults had never seen before. Just as she was about to go downstairs to get Lucian, she spun around and found him already standing behind her. Mr. Farwell, you know what Ms. Estella's character is like. She's always been unsociable, and she doesn't know how to speak. Please be more patient with her. How will things work out if you don't communicate with her properly? Ms. Estella is different from other children. Aren't you worried that her condition might worsen? Catalina asked. The sound of something crashing onto the ground in the room made Catalina extremely anxious. She was so worried that her eyes reddened when she uttered the last sentence. Noticing the adults entering her room, she backed away subconsciously and lowered her head to avoid meeting their gaze. Lucian's heart ached when he saw the state of the girl. Feeling regretful, he stepped forward, wanting to pull her into his embrace. Sensing that he was approaching her, Estella raised her head immediately, her eyes filled with resistance. With her hands on the ground she scurried backward frantically. Lucian paused when he saw her reactions. Don't be afraid. I know I was wrong. Estella did not seem to hear his words. Finally, she leaned against the wall and turned her body sideways to avoid his gaze. She hugged her knees and buried her head inside. The adults could not see her expression. All they saw were the heaving meteors of Estella's body when she sobbed. Lucian fell silent instantly. Feeling heartbroken, Catalina stepped forward. Mr. Farwell, why don't I give it a go? With that, she carefully approached Estella and extended her arms toward the little girl. This time, Estella did not avoid it. Catalina let out a sigh of relief and hugged Estella gently, patting the latter on the back. What's wrong, Ms. Estella? Can you tell me about it? Were you bullied by your classmates in school? Estella merely continued sobbing, showing no response whatsoever. Catalina had no choice but to coax Estella in her embrace. Is it because the twins didn't go to school? Lucian asked grimly. Estella's eyes lit up a little, and she turned her head aside with a sob. Noticing her slight reaction, Catalina quickly hinted at Lucian with a look to console Estella. Lucian sighed. He did not expect Estella to be so dependent on the twins. Could they be somewhat attracted to each other because they're siblings from another mother? Okay. I won't make them leave the kindergarten. It was only then that Estella looked at him, looking extremely aggrieved. His daughter's state left Lucian no choice but to give in. I promise you. I won't chase them away again. Estella still stared at him with a gaze filled with accusations. Understanding the meaning of her gaze, Lucian said gently, they didn't go to school today because they took a sick leave. The teacher hasn't told them about their expulsion. Estella blinked, and her sobs reduced. Still in disbelief, she pursed her lips. She had heard Lucian talking to her teacher with her own cars, and the two boys were absent from kindergarten that day. How could there be such a coincidence? Lucian sensed her doubt, which made him feel even more helpless. There's no need for me to lie to you. They didn't go to school today because they were unwell. You'll see them tomorrow. Estella continued to purse her lips aggrievedly. Suspicion was written all over her face. Lucian was at a loss for what to do. How should I make you believe me? Never did he expect Archie and Benny to have such an important place in Estella's heart. They were so important to the point that she did not believe his words. Estella hesitated for a moment and let Catalina put her down. She then picked up a small notebook from the pile of mess and scribbled something while sobbing. Her squiggly writing read, "Confirm." She wanted to hear the boys tell her that they were not expelled and that she would still see them in kindergarten in the future. Lucian understood what she meant. She wanted to go to Roxanne's house and confirm with the boys. The thought of it made his head hurt. Seeing there was no response from Lucian, Estella pursed her lips and gripped her notebook tightly in her hands. She looked as if she was about to burst into tears again. When Lucian recalled how miserably Estella had cried just now, he relaxed his brows helplessly and said, "Okay. I'll bring you to them now." Estella froze instantly, blinking to confirm what she had heard. Lucian nodded. She quickly turned around and packed her bag, then carried it on her back and walked toward him, still sniffling since she had cried too hard earlier. Lucian felt speechless when he saw how fast Estella's attitude changed. Given no choice, he brought her out to look for Roxanne. Roxanne was having dinner with Archie and Benny when the doorbell rang. Thinking it was Madeline coming for a free meal, Roxanne opened the door right away. Her eyes widened in disbelief when she saw the people at the door. "Are you two? Essie, are you here to play with Archie and Benny?" That was the only possibility she could think of. A tall and slender Lucian stood in front of the door, holding Estella's hand. He was only dressed in a shirt with the sleeves slightly rolled up. Estella lifted her head. Roxanne could not help but wonder if it was the breeze that caused Estella's eyes and nose to be red because the latter looked rather pitiful. When she saw that Roxanne had seen her, all the sadness Estella had been feeling the entire night rose in her heart. She sniffed and pursed her lips, having the urge to cry again. Lucian noticed the change in his daughter's behavior. However, he did not know how to answer Roxanne's question. What am I supposed to say? My daughter got angry because I told the kindergarten to expel your sons? And now, she insists on confirming the reason for their absence? He did not find it necessary to bring it up again since he had already dismissed the idea. At that moment, the atmosphere at the door was rather awkward. Roxanne eyed the pair in front of her who did not seem to have any intentions of speaking. Feeling puzzled, she lowered her head to look at Estella. "Essie, is something the matter? It's quite late already." Pursing her lips, Estella nodded and broke free from Lucian's hand. He had no choice but to let her be. In the next second, tears rolled down Estella's cheeks again, and she approached Roxanne, extending her arm. Estella wanted a hug. At first, Roxanne was stunned by Estella's actions. But after that, her heart ached for the latter. She instinctively lowered herself and pulled Estella into her embrace, patting her on the back. Estella tugged at the hem of Roxanne's clothes, sobbing uncontrollably. A look of helplessness flashed past Lucian's eyes as he watched the scene before him. When we were at home a while ago, all Estella did was avoid me. Now that Roxanne's here, this girl actually reached out without hesitation to ask for a hug. Are children naturally dependent on their mothers? Okay. Stop crying. Can you tell me what's wrong? Roxanne consoled Estella, feeling worried. Naturally, Estella did not know how to speak. Finally, Lucian cleared his throat and said nonchalantly, "She went to kindergarten today and did not see your boys, so she thought they stopped going. She went home and cried the entire night, asking to come here to confirm their reason for absence." Roxanne sighed inwardly upon hearing that. This little girl is really clingy to my boys, eh? Realizing that, Roxanne said in a softer tone, There. Don't cry. The boys were having an upset stomach today, so I helped them to apply for a leave of absence. They'll be going back to school to play with you tomorrow." When she heard Roxanne saying the same words as Lucian, Estella finally believed it. Slowly, she stopped sobbing and removed herself from Roxanne's embrace. And carefully, she peeped into the house, wanting to see the two boys. However, it was impossible to view the dining room from the entrance. When she did not see the twins, she started feeling uneasy again. Roxanne noticed Estella's cautious looks, and her heart melted. Patting Estella's head, she asked, "Do you want to play with them? I can take you to them." With that, she smiled and carried Estella. Just as she was about to walk into the house, Estella suddenly leaned back. It was at that moment Roxanne recalled that the man was still standing at the door. On top of that, he would not enter the house without her invitation. At that thought, she turned around to look at the man. As the night breeze blew, Lucian's shirt clung to his body, and he stared impassively at the girls. Looks like he was rushing to bring Essie here that he forgot to put on a coat. Thanks to Estella, who was in her arms, Roxanne felt bad for him, and she said calmly, "Have a seat inside, Mr. Farwell." Lucian entered the house as soon as she spoke. "The boys are having their dinner. Let me bring you over to them." Roxanne walked slowly, comforting Estella along the way. Soon, 3 of them arrived in the dining room. Archie and Benny were enjoying their food when they saw them walking in. They swallowed the food in their mouths, a puzzled look on their faces. What is Essie doing here? Roxanne placed Estella between them and said softly, Essie got worried when both of you didn't go to kindergarten today. She cried, wanting to look for you. Go on. Talk to her. As if to confirm Roxanne's words, Estella interlaced her fingers nervously on her dress and looked unblinkingly at Archie and Benny with her large eyes. The tip of her nose was slightly pink, making her look like a doll. Archie and Benny exchanged gazes when they saw Estella in such a state. They found her cute yet pitiful at the same time. We weren't feeling well this morning. We're much better now. Don't worry. Lucian, who was standing at the entrance of the dining room, looked conflicted when he saw Estella finally smiling. It took me so long to coax HCR, yet it was nothing compared to the trio's words. Not only did she stop crying, she even smiled. After standing there for some time and watching the boys making Estella grin from ear to car, he stepped into the room, wanting to take her home. They had only come over because Estella wanted to confirm things with her own eyes. Now that it was done, it was time for them to go home. As soon as he reached Estella's side, he heard her stomach growl. Roxanne frowned. Have you not had dinner? Estella pursed her lips and nodded. Seeing that, Roxanne turned to look at Lucienne with a reprimanding gaze. Lucian glanced at her emotionlessly. I've tried talking to her. She's been crying all night. She locked herself in the room as soon as she got back without eating or drinking anything. It was only when I promised to bring her here that she finally stopped. We didn't manage to have dinner yet. Roxanne scanned his thin shirt and withdrew her gaze. At the side, Archie looked at Estella concernedly. We've just started eating. Do you want to join us? Estella's eyes lit up, and she nodded fervently. It was at that moment that she finally remembered to ask her father for permission. Lucian hesitated for a few seconds and glanced at Roxanne. If it's not too much of a trouble, could you prepare something for her? Do you want to sit between the boys? Roxanne suggested. Estella beamed instantly. Archie and Benny quickly moved their chairs, making some space so Estella could sit between them. Lucian frowned as he watched Estella sit between the twins. Archie reassured earnestly. Benny turned to Essie and made a face. Look at you, all scared like that. We're just taking a day off. Can't you be away from us for just a day? You little minion. A sense of relief washed over Estella when she heard their words, and she broke into a smile. From his point of view, they looked like a family, while he looked more like a stranger. After helping Estella to settle down and serving her some food, Roxanne looked at the three children sitting side by side and was all smiles. However, the gaze of the man beside her sent chills down her spine. She stopped smiling and turned around to look at Lucian. As he met her gaze, Lucian composed himself and put on a calm expression. What about you? Roxanne asked casually, repressing her feelings. Upon hearing that, Lucian put on a look of confusion. Roxanne averted her gaze and glanced at the dishes on the table. Have you eaten? If Essie made a fuss without having dinner, then he must have been busy coaxing her the entire night. Stunned, Lucian stared at her for some time before narrowing his eyes indifferently. Sounding distant, he answered, I'm fine. Here's dinner at home. I'll just heat it up when I get back. It's just that Essie likes spending time with them. Sorry for troubling you. I'll just wait in the living room and not disturb you guys." With that, he cast the three joyful children a final glance before walking out. When Roxanne heard his words and noticed he was about to leave on an empty stomach, she could not help but purse her lips. "There's enough food for all of us. Besides, Essie will definitely feel uneasy if her daddy's not here." Estella lifted her head, her eyes filled with nervousness when she saw Lucian walking out. "Oh Eunice!" Without waiting for Lucian's reply, Roxanne served him a plate of food and placed it on the table. "Come and join us if you don't mind." Archie frowned slightly at the scene, but he said nothing. Benny, on the other hand, continued eating while secretly glancing at the man in the distance, feeling excited. In the past, it had always been the three of them: Roxanne, Archie, Benny having meals together, occasionally with Madeline joining in. However, it was a first for them to have their meal with Lucian. At that moment, various emotions rose in Archie's and Benny's hearts. Lucian stopped in his tracks and turned around to meet Estella's glistening eyes. He then shifted his gaze to the seat beside them, which had utensils placed on the table near it. His eyes immediately glinted with emotion. As the matter of fact, the four of them were indeed a family. It would seem odd if he were to sit there. Though that thought passed through his mind, he had already taken his seat by the table before even realizing it. For some reason, the atmosphere that was originally jolly had become tense. He could not help but wonder if he was the reason for the change. Archie and Benny fell silent and lowered their heads to eat their food. Since the boys were not talking to her anymore, Estella lost her appetite. She held her utensils and took tiny bites out of her food. "Essie, is there something you dislike?" Roxanne asked gently, noticing the change in her behavior. Hearing that, Estella hurriedly shook her head. She liked everything Roxanne made. She just wasn't in the mood to eat. Benny knew Estella could not talk. Thus, he put down his utensils and answered on her behalf, "Essie is just like us. She doesn't like carrots and peppers. She always picks these out in the kindergarten." Roxanne smiled kindly. "I'll help you pick them out, okay?" A smile reappeared on Estella's face, and she nodded obediently. Seeing her response, Roxanne walked over to Estella, picked out the carrots and peppers from the latter's plate, and placed them on her own. She then watched Estella picking up her spoon again. Just as Estella was about to continue eating, something tugged the back of her hand, which made her tear up in pain. She stopped moving her arm, lifted her head, and looked at Roxanne Pilani for help. Noticing the expression on Estella's face, Roxanne put down her utensils right away. "What's wrong?" Estella bit her lip, trying her best to stop herself from crying as she turned over her hand to let Roxanne examine it. Everyone was stunned as soon as they saw the back of her hand. Estella had extremely fair skin. As the light shone on the back of her hand, a horrifying red mark could be seen visibly. Roxanne frowned and asked worriedly, "What happened?" Estella bit her lip without saying anything. Roxanne had no choice but to glance at Lucian, who was sitting beside her. Lucian felt a pang of guilt when he met her questioning gaze. Despite that, he looked as calm as ever. "Did you hurt yourself when you were throwing things just now?" The worry in Roxanne's eyes intensified. Throwing things? Lucian said, Essie doesn't know how to vent her emotions. Sometimes, when she gets really angry, she'll throw things to vent it out. He could not bring himself to utter the word autism. On top of that, he did not know what her reaction would be once she found out about it. Surprise flashed through Roxanne's eyes as she turned to look at Estella to confirm the fact. Did you hurt yourself? Estella hesitated momentarily before nodding gently. Marie seeing her admitting to it, Lucian frowned. Why didn't you tell me? Vn Estella shuddered and inched closer to Roxanne, feeling frightened. Roxanne cast Lucian another displeased glance when she saw Estella's reaction. Asne saw the kids injured. How could he still speak to her in such a tone? Does it hurt a lot? Retracting her gaze, Roxanne held Estella's hand and massaged it gently. Estella pursed her lips and nodded. You'll be fine. I'll help you to apply medicine. It won't hurt in a while. Roxanne gently released Estella's hand and instructed her boys, keep her company. I'll get the medical kit. The boys nodded immediately and started taking turns telling Estella some interesting things. Soon, Roxanne returned with the medical kit, and she carefully applied some medicinal cream onto Estella's hand. Estella was well behaved throughout the entire process. When it hurt, she would only shrink away a little and would quickly place her hand back. It made Roxanne's heart melt incredibly. After applying the medicine to Estella's hand, Roxanne immediately occupied the seat beside her. Archie gave up his seat obediently and carried his plate to sit beside Lucian. Is it okay if I feed you? Roxanne asked Estella for her permission. Use naturally, Estella would not reject it. She nodded with a look of anticipation. Roxanne picked up Estella's plate with a smile and started feeding her. With Roxanne feeding her, Estella's appetite improved tremendously. She fixed her eyes on Roxanne, opening her mouth to eat anything she fed. Roxanne's smile grew wider when she saw how well-behaved Estella was while eating. Lucian watched their interaction from the opposite end. Every time Estella's lips were stained, Roxanne would help her wipe them right away. Even her feeding speed was just right. Estella's eyes crinkled as she ate. For a moment, a mix of emotions flashed through Lucian's eyes. Meanwhile, Archie and Benny had been watching everything in silence. They merely thought that Estella looked cute when she ate instead of feeling jealous of her. When they looked away from her, they glanced at Lucian at the same time. The next second, they exchanged suspicious glances with each other. If we're not mistaken, Daddy has been staring at Mommy. Besides, there doesn't seem to be any hate in his gaze. Instead, it looks affectionate. Archie frowned and put down his fork. He picked up the ladle by the side and served Lucian some food while looking at him innocently. Mr. Farwell, why aren't you eating? Do eat more. Hearing that, Lucian snapped back to his senses and thanked Archie subconsciously, thanks. As soon as he said that and saw the vegetable on his plate, his gaze darkened. Coincidentally, the vegetable Archie chose was celery. Lucian looked up and scanned the dishes on the table to find the plate of celery placed quite far from Archie's reach. It looked as if the latter had served him celery on purpose. When Archie finished his words, he buried his head in his plate and eyed Lucian from the corner of his eye. He remembered that celery was the vegetable Lucian hated the most the last time he and Benny looked into his background. I don't know why he abandoned Mommy in the past and was looking at her with such a gaze just now. But since he abandoned Mommy, he must be punished. This bit of celery is nothing. Lucian picked up his fork, looking meaningfully at the boy who served him the vegetable. Sensing his gaze, Archie lifted his head and met Lucian's gaze fearlessly. Lucian raised his brow. For some reason, he sensed that Archie was challenging him. However, Lucian could not figure out what was the reason for the challenge. Thus, he did not think much about it. Do you dislike celery, Mr. Farwell? Archie looked at Lucian innocently. His words seemed to be urging the latter. Lucian smiled and replied, "No." With that, he put the celery into his mouth impassively. Benny's eves brightened. Emboldened by Lucian's acceptance of Archie's gesture, he tentatively attempted the same. Taking the plunge, he placed a roast potato on the man's plate and stared at him expectantly. The boy's thoughtful gesture stunned Lucian, as he thought the former would complicate things for him. He offered a grateful smile upon regaining his composure. "Thank you. Have some more potatoes yourself." As he spoke, Lucian reciprocated the gesture. Having remembered the vegetables the boy mentioned not liking earlier, he deliberately avoided those. Benny's eyes widened in surprise. "Thank you, Mr. Farwell. I will. Oh, Daddy gave me food." Meanwhile, Archie pouted in disdain as he observed their interaction. Benny is such an idiot. He can't even see such an obvious ploy of Daddy currying his favor. I won't be that easily fooled. The rest of dinner passed with that strange atmosphere hanging over them. Roxanne got up to clear the table when they finished. Lucian silently helped her put the silverware back in the kitchen drawer out of politeness. Upon completing that task, he stood around hesitantly, as he was unsure what to do next. Owisuns, though it stood to reason that he should return with Estella. He thought it would seem inappropriate to just leave after putting Roxanne through the trouble of hosting dinner. "I can manage on my own," Roxanne asserted when she noticed his discomfort. "Could you keep an eye on the children?" From a certain angle, Archie could not see the look of disgust that flashed through Lucian's eyes as he swallowed the celery. Roxanne watched the man put the celery into his mouth. It was too late when he turned away. She saw the look of disgust in his eyes. Suddenly, she felt as if she had returned to the days 6 years ago. "You can put it aside if you don't want to eat it." Roxanne retracted her gaze and lowered her eyes to conceal her emotions. The man's calm voice rang out. "I didn't say I'm not eating it." A mix of emotions swirled within Roxanne, and she kept silent. Lucian nodded and headed to the living room. Estella was working with the boys on the final stages of a search Lego project they had been working on together. Having already assembled a section, the children were struggling with the height of where it was supposed to be attached. Roxanne was usually close by to lend a hand after the preliminary assembly was completed on the ground. As she was busy with the dishes at that moment, the children stood around, figuring out how to circumvent that obstacle. After a glance around, Archie decided to bring a chair from the dining table here. "Let me." Taking pity on the children, Lucian softened his expression to the best of his ability and offered Archie a hand. Archie hesitated for several seconds before handing the assembled part in his hands to the man following Archie's instructions. Lucian took it and snapped it in place. "Thank you," Archie said gruffly. Lucian nodded noncommittally. With one hand in his pocket, he mostly watched the three children amuse themselves with the toy bricks and occasionally lent a hand with the assembly. In the kitchen, Roxanne was distracted. Instead of the chore at hand, her attention was stubbornly fixed on the group in her living room. She was beginning to regret allowing Lucian to stay after dinner. Archie and Benny had already revealed too much when they confronted Lucian the last time, so Roxanne felt deeply uneasy about them being alone together. The way they got along, especially, bothered her a lot. She was even more afraid that the boys would say something they were not supposed to. If Lucian finds out that the boys are his. Roxanne felt a panic rising in her chest at that very thought. She could not guarantee that Lucian would not take them away from her. Given her current status, it would be easy for him to rob her of her sons. She could not imagine how she would feel then. It was hard enough to conceive of a future without the two boys. Roxanne began to feel truly frightened. The bowl slipped through her fingers and fell to the ground before she could react. The crisp sound of shattering glass shook her out of her reverie. Startled, the four in the living room looked toward the kitchen as one. The three children exchanged glances before putting the pieces down in an unspoken agreement and running into the kitchen. "What happened, Mommy?" Archie and Benny asked in concern. Their voices roused Roxanne out of her trance. She felt even more uneasy at the sight of her sons before her. Barely able to suppress her fears, she shook her head and mustered a smile. "It's nothing," she said. "The bowl must have slipped out of my hand. Don't come in. There are broken pieces everywhere." With that, she squatted down as if nothing had happened to pick up the pieces, still distracted as she did so. Lucian's eyes darkened from behind the three children as he studied the woman on her knees. "I could be imagining it, but this woman does seem to have a lot on her mind." Roxanne lowered her head. The man's intense gaze upon her disconcerted her further. In a momentary lapse of vigilance, her fingers closed around a particularly sharp corner of a shard. A tingling pain erupting from her fingertips snapped her back to her senses, and she gave an involuntary gasp of pain. "Mommy! Ms. Jarvis!" The children cried out anxiously as blood dripped from Roxanne's finger. Archie and Benny were about to dash into the kitchen when a tall figure suddenly stopped in front of them. A moment later, they watched Lucian squat beside their mother to hold her wrist in his large hand with a cold expression on his face. Archie and Benny froze in their tracks. "What were you thinking?" he asked with irritation. Roxanne stared blankly at the vast hand on hers. She was at a loss for words. Lucian wrapped his arms around her waist and lifted her to her feet in an instant. Roxanne was already standing by the sink when she regained her senses. Looking ill-tempered, Lucian turned on the faucet and dragged her wrist under the stream of water. "Wait outside," Lucian ordered, turning his attention to the three children by the door. "Do not come in." Though the children were worried about Roxanne, they nodded when they saw that she was in good hands. Upon being satisfied that the wound on the woman's hand was clean enough, Lucian took out a clean handkerchief from his pocket and wrapped it around her injured finger to stem the bleeding. "Thank you." By that point, Roxanne had regained sufficient control of her faculties. She tried to jerk her hand out of his while avoiding his gaze. "I can finish up on my own." The man frowned and tightened his grip. Roxanne felt annoyed at his refusal to let go. He has a child with another woman. Essie is watching us right now. Distinctly aware of Estella's eyes on them, Roxanne tried her best to distance herself from Lucian. He has no cause to care for me to this extent. He only has hatred toward me, anyway. Grimacing at the reminder, Roxanne gazed at him with plain refusal for his help. Lucian pretended not to have noticed her resistance. "I'm going to dress your wound," he announced solemnly. Without another word, he led her out by her hand. Roxanne gritted her teeth in consternation. "Please don't trouble yourself. It's late enough as it is, you should take Essie home. I can manage on my own." Lucian froze in his tracks at her words. Roxanne noticed a vague dissatisfaction emanating out of him that disappeared without a trace by the next second. "How will you dress your wound when your right hand is the injured one?" Lucian suppressed his annoyance and dragged her out without paying her protests any heed. The three children followed them eagerly. Roxanne did not struggle any more under their concerned gazes. Instead, she resigned herself to her fate. This man is too domineering. When they arrived in the living room, Roxanne was forced to sit on the couch. The children flocked around her as they stared with concern at her finger wrapped in a handkerchief while Lucian rummaged unsuccessfully through the living room to locate the medical kit. In the end, Archie was the one to jump off the couch to produce the medical kit from the TV cabinet. Lucian patted the boy's head in gratitude and stood next to Roxanne with the kit now in his hand. North-northeast. The children hurriedly stepped aside. Lucian sat down beside Roxanne. Though his face did not betray a hint of his thoughts and his presence caused a perceptible shudder in her, his movements seemed gentler than usual. Roxanne watched him work for several seconds before being compelled to look away. She willed herself to keep her gaze on the floor. Looking any longer would create unnecessary misunderstandings. "The man obviously hates me. Why is he so caring all of a sudden?" After having iodine applied to her cut, Lucian produced another band-aid and wrapped it around her wound. Roxanne sighed in secret relief when he finally let go of her hand. She leaped up as soon as she could place some distance between them. "Thank you, and sorry again for troubling you." The man frowned slightly at her words but did not respond. NWA. Roxanne glanced at the mess on the kitchen floor and made to get up. "Mess, what are you doing?" The sullen voice sounded again. Roxanne froze. "The floor needs cleaning up," she said. "The children might step on the shards." Lucian's scowl deepened. Despite this woman's stellar credentials, she can't even take care of herself. Roxanne grew anxious at the man's gloomy expression, not knowing what she had done wrong this time. Could it be because of the trouble she had caused him earlier? After careful consideration, Roxanne was about to apologize when he spoke again. "You can't get your bandage wet. Let me find you a housekeeper." Without giving her a chance to respond, Lucian gave his assistant a call. After his dinner, Caden was about to wash up and tuck in when he suddenly received a call from his employer. He picked up the phone nervously. "Find me housekeeper and deliver them to number 32 of Durwist Garden within half an hour." Caden was stunned. Before he managed to formulate his question, the other had already hung up. After gazing at his darkened screen in confusion for several seconds, Caden contacted a housekeeping company and personally escorted the housekeeper to the address as instructed by Lucian. They're on their way, Lucian informed Roxanne in a low voice after hanging up. Roxanne's protests ceased as he had already found a housekeeper. She seated herself some distance away from him. The three children sat between the two adults and exchanged glances in silence. The atmosphere in the living room was stiff. Nearly 20 minutes later, the doorbell was a relief as it broke the uncomfortable silence in the living room. Roxanne was about to get up to answer the door, but Lucian arrived first. Roxanne breathed a sigh of relief at how little effort it took. Having expected to go to further lengths than that for a suitable nanny, she was surprised to find such a promising candidate so easily. "Come over tomorrow morning," Roxanne proposed after a brief discussion regarding Lisa's salary range. "I will draw up the contract by then. You can sign it if everything is in order." Lisa nodded in response. After bidding the others farewell, she departed with her tools and left the few of them in the living room once again. Though Roxanne's mood improved after the chat with Lisa, her stiff formality returned when she turned to Lucian. "I'm sorry for the trouble of bandaging my wound and finding me a housekeeper. I owe you one." A strange glint flitted across Lucian's deep eyes. He quickly suppressed the arising feeling and responded with a similar detachment, "Don't mention it. Essie and I were the ones to trouble you in the first place. Consider these trivial matters a token of my gratitude." Estella nodded in vigorous agreement with her father's words. She even ran over to grab Roxanne's wrist and stared at her bandaged finger for a long time. Roxanne smiled as she stroked the little girl's head. "It's all right. Don't worry. It doesn't hurt at all." Estella blinked as she touched Roxanne's fingers delicately. Upon ascertaining that there was indeed no problem, she looked up and gave the latter a sweet smile. "Mr. Farwell." Caden stood on the other end with a middle-aged woman with short hair. Lucian stood sideways as he beckoned them in. The housekeeper cleaned the kitchen with surprising efficiency while striking up an animated conversation with the three children as she worked. She amused the children so much they could not stop laughing. After seeing how fond the children were of the housekeeper, Roxanne was struck with an idea. She decided to take the initiative to ask, "Excuse me. I'd like to ask if you would consider working here full-time. Your main duties will be caring for the children with some housekeeping now and then. I'll leave the salary to you." The woman readily agreed, "I would love to, I happen to like children. You can call me Lisa." Roxanne's heart softened at the child's tenderness. "It's getting late. We have intruded upon your kind hospitality long enough." Lucian cleared his throat as he lowered his gaze to Estella. "Say goodbye to Ms. Jarvis and the boys, Essie." Looking as if she did not want to, Estella waved to the boys obediently at the prospect of seeing them the following day. The two boys reciprocated her smile and waved. "Wait for us at the kindergarten tomorrow." Essie nodded vigorously. Lucian took the little girl's hand and, with a final goodbye to the three, turned to leave. It was only when she watched his car disappear out of the driveway that Roxanne relaxed completely. Two boys seemed reluctant to part with their guests as they stared into the distance for a long time without taking their eyes off the spot Lucian's car had disappeared. Roxanne thought they missed Estella. "Come on, boys. Let's go inside," she said softly. "You'll see Essie tomorrow." The two boys looked away slowly and followed her back to the mansion. After shutting the door, Roxanne bent down to look solemnly into the eyes of her two sons. "I have something to tell you boys." Archie and Benny were puzzled at the sight of her seriousness. "If Essie's father ever asks how old you are to tell him that you're 1 year younger than her. Do you understand?" The boys understood at once, yet they pretended not to. "Why?" they demanded. Roxanne hesitated, at a loss for an explanation, before sighing helplessly. "There is no reason. Just do as I say, please." The boys exchanged another glance before nodding slowly. Archie did not betray a hint of emotion. His brother, however, looked confused. "It's clear why Mommy wants us to tell Daddy that we are 1 year younger than Essie. It's to make it impossible for him to find out that we are his. What happened between Mommy and Daddy? He was kind to her, wasn't he? Why doesn't Mommy want him to know that we are his children?" It was nearly 10 when Lucian arrived home with Estella. The butler was already waiting at the door. "Miss Pearson is waiting for you inside, Mr. Farwell." Lucian's brows furrowed at the news. With a nod at the butler, he strode in with Estella. "You're home." Aubrey, seated on the couch, leaped to her feet when she saw them crossing the threshold. She bent down and tried to touch Estella's head, which the latter did her best to avoid. Aubrey's eyes flashed with displeasure, which she quickly hid by straightening up with a smile. "What's the matter?" Lucian studied her intently. His tone remained indifferent. Aubrey gave him a casual smile. "I want to thank you again for lending us someone today. You helped us out of a jam there, and Dad had me come over to offer our gratitude personally." She was going to add something else after a brief pause, but Lucian cut her off. "Is the matter resolved?" Aubrey was momentarily dumbfounded by his bluntness. She nodded with a smile that now seemed rather forced. "Well, the little trouble we had kept us busy until the afternoon. I hope it didn't interfere with your business." Lucian nodded. "There are plenty of employees in Farwell Group, and the absence of one wouldn't make a difference. There's no need to thank me." Without waiting for her response, he strode past her with Estella. Aubrey's features contorted with fury, but they softened again when she regained her senses a few moments later. "Nevertheless, you have helped me resolve something huge. I didn't know what to get you, so I brought a little present for Estella instead. Don't worry. I didn't spend a fortune. Think of it as a token of my appreciation." As she spoke, she took out a limited edition doll from the bag on the couch. Its delicate packaging caused Lucian to recognize it as one in a set that Estella had in her room. Aware that his daughter loved those dolls, he stopped to see if she wanted to accept the gift. Unexpectedly, Essie did not even look up. Instead, she tightened her grip on her father's hand and edged closer to him. Lucian understood at once. He met Aubrey's eaves to decline her gift. "Thank you for the doll, but she already has this one. Besides, she's thrown a tantrum at me earlier. Forgive us for not being in the mood to entertain." Aubrey's expression was a little stiff. She put away her things with a smile that looked more like a grimace before looking at Estella with concern. What is she angry about this time? Having hit multiple dead ends in trying to interact with the girl before, Aubrey did not try very hard this time for fear that Lucian would see through her falsities. Instead, she directed her question toward him. "Oh, something small," Lucian said curtly before looking away, plainly not intending to divulge specific details. "Maybe he thinks it's not my place to be privy to such matters." Aubrey's hand holding the gift bag clenched into a fist. Her nails sank deep into her flesh as she forced a smile. "Is that so? Did you return this late because you took her for a fun night out?" Lucian frowned. "It's getting late. You should leave if there isn't anything else I can do for you. Essie needs her sleep." Aubrey opened her mouth again, but no excuse came to her lips. She could only watch Lucian lead Estella past her as they made their way upstairs. Aubrey appeared unmistakably grim as she exited the mansion. Her bodyguard, also her driver, noticed her expression and decided to tread lightly. "Do you wish to return home, Ms. Pearson?" Aubrey glared at him. "I want you to find out where Lucian was tonight with him." The bodyguard shuddered before obliging her hastily. The following morning, Aubrey was having breakfast when her bodyguard called. "Ms. Pearson, I've checked it out. Last night, Mr. Farwell took Ms. Estella to a woman surnamed Jarvis. They stayed at her place for almost 3 hours before leaving. Alas, before the bodyguard could finish his sentence, the beeping of a disconnected call rang out from the other end. There was no doubt in Aubrey's mind that the woman in question was Roxanne Jarvis. The more she pictured Lucian and Roxanne spending time together, the more her face twisted with anger. What could they have done in that 3 hours? "I can't believe they had Estella with them too." A fresh swell of rage rose in Aubrey as she stood up and flung her phone away, her eyes full of crazed fury. Samuel, who was eating his breakfast opposite her, looked up with a frown when he heard the commotion. To his surprise, he saw his daughter standing menacingly by the table while her phone lay on the floor, smashed to smithereens. "What's going on?" Samuel asked sternly after setting his cutlery down. Aubrey met her father's gaze and gritted her teeth. "Roxanne Jarvis is back, and Lucian has been keeping his distance from me recently. I think he has plans to reconcile with her," she grumbled, sounding somewhat pitiful toward the end. Samuel's gaze darkened instantly. "Do Elias and Sonia know about this?" As far as he knew, Roxanne had run off without saying goodbye back then, leaving only a divorce agreement behind. For that reason, Elias and Sonia strongly resented her. Now that Roxanne had shamelessly returned to their son, one could only imagine how they'd react if they found out about it. Upon hearing her father's words, Aubrey's brow twitched as a thought flashed through her mind. "Find an opportunity to inform the Farwells about that woman's return," Samuel suggested, which helped to affirm Aubrey's idea. "I'm sure they're very unhappy with her." With that, Aubrey nodded and slowly went back to her seat. Seeing that his daughter had calmed down, Samuel knitted his brows and advised earnestly. "That woman has only just come back, so we can't be sure what intentions Lucian has toward her. Don't get yourself all worked up over nothing. Besides, Elias and Sonia know how loyal you've been to their son and how much you've done for him. Even if that woman comes into the picture, they'd still be on your side. You have nothing to fear." After hearing Samuel's reassuring words, Aubrey felt a lot more at ease and visibly regained her composure. "Got it. I'll remember to keep my cool." Meanwhile, Roxanne had finished her breakfast and sent Archie and Benny to the kindergarten. When the teacher, Pippa Ward, saw the three of them, a concerned look crept across her face. How are Archie and Benny? Are they feeling better? Roxanne smiled and nodded. Yes, they've recovered. Thanks for your concern. The two boys looked up at Pippa and greeted her politely. Good morning, Ms. Ward. Naturally, Pippa's eyes filled with adoration at how well-behaved and sensible the kids were. Amid their conversation, the sound of a car door opening and closing suddenly rang out. It was a rare sight as Estella ran toward the school's entrance while waving wordlessly at Roxanne and the boys. Seeing that the little girl was too caught up in the excitement to care about road safety, Roxanne quickly rushed over to hold her hand. When she saw Lucian walking calmly toward them, she couldn't help but feel a sense of helplessness. Estella grinned from ear to ear as she held Roxanne's hand. Once they stopped walking, she even hugged the latter's leg affectionately. Archie and Benny weren't jealous either and greeted Estella with big, friendly smiles. When Lucian finally came to stand beside them, Benny boldly tugged at his suit sleeve. Puzzled, the man lowered his head to look at the boy. Good morning, Mr. Farwell. Benny exclaimed, flashing an innocent grin. Lucian raised his eyebrows slightly, but his surprise soon turned to gentleness. Oh, good morning to you too. Having gotten his father's reply, Benny smiled even brighter. Archie, however, merely pursed his lips and gave Lucian a nod. Of course, Lucian returned the greeting in the same manner. Upon seeing how close the two families seemed, Pippa mused, Wow, Ms. Jarvis, I suppose you must be on excellent terms with Estella. That's pretty rare, you know. I've taught her for so long, yet she's never been this clingy with me. Everyone instantly turned to look, only to see a Bentley parked conspicuously on the street. Lucian had stepped out of the car and scooped Estella from the back seat into his arms. Car MS. Even though he wanted to carry her to the entrance, Estella struggled to get down as soon as she saw Roxanne and her sons. Thankfully, Lucian wasn't insistent and put his daughter down on the ground as she wanted. However, just as he was about to reach for Estella's hand, he realized she had already scampered away. For a moment, Lucian was stunned as he subconsciously turned to look behind him. Much to his surprise, he saw Roxanne and the rest smiling fondly at Estella, with the former even walking toward the little girl. Roxanne glanced at the little girl holding her leg and simply answered with a chuckle. Estella refused to leave Roxanne's side, but that didn't matter since it was still early, and not many children had arrived at the kindergarten. Thus, Roxanne and the kids decided to remain standing at the door to chat with Pippa. Fortunately, Lucian had called the kindergarten head the night before to scrap the twins' expulsion, so Pippa never once mentioned how close Archie and Benny had been to getting kicked out of school. Naturally, Roxanne continued to be kept in the dark. After the three kids held hands and walked into school together, Roxanne turned around to prepare to leave. Alas, she felt her heart skip a beat when she accidentally met Lucian's gaze. She had been chatting with Pippa for so long that she almost forgot that Lucian was standing quietly behind her. Asterisk if there's nothing else, I'll be off to work, Mr. Farwell, Roxanne uttered, striding off before Lucian could even say anything. As he watched her retreating figure, Lucian's gaze darkened. The sight of Roxanne and the three kids chatting with Pippa earlier had left him in a daze. To him, it felt as though they were a family. Only after Roxanne had sped off in her car did Lucian finally gather his thoughts and walk to his Bentley. After leaving the kindergarten, Roxanne made a beeline for the research institute. Thanks to the Queen family's supply of herbs, the once stagnant research gradually got back on track and continued to progress smoothly. Roxanne kept herself busy the entire morning, and by the time Jonathan called, it was already noon. "Dr. Jarvis, what time will you be dropping by this afternoon? I'll wait for you at home." Hearing that, Roxanne suddenly recalled her appointment with Alfred for his treatment. "Oh my gosh! I've been so busy this morning that if it weren't for Jonathan's reminder, I'd have forgotten something as important as this." Snapping herself out of it, Roxanne glanced at the work she had left and gave Jonathan a time. Despite that, she made it a point to arrive earlier before her appointment that afternoon. The Queen's butler was already acquainted with Roxanne and knew her treatment was working wonders for Alfred's health. As such, his attitude toward her underwent a 180, and he now treated her with the utmost respect. Roxanne quickly composed herself and shifted her gaze from Aubrey to Jonathan. Sharp-eyed as usual, it didn't take long for Jonathan to notice the awkwardness between the two women. He casually approached Roxanne, making sure to block Aubrey's line of sight as he did. "Dr. Jarvis, my grandfather is already waiting for you upstairs. Shall we go up now?" Oksonine nodded. With that, Jonathan turned to Aubrey to excuse himself and began walking toward the stairs with Roxanne in tow. As soon as the two of them got to the stairway, Aubrey spoke up again. "Ms. Jarvis, I heard that your course of treatment has helped old Mr. Queen a lot. I think I shall use this chance to visit him and see you work your magic." Right after saying that, Aubrey followed behind them. Roxanne knitted her brows, clearly displeased. However, since Jonathan didn't object to it, she had no choice but to pretend that Aubrey didn't exist. Under Roxanne's treatment, Alfred had recovered a fair bit, so much so that he was well enough to move back into his bedroom. When they got to his room, they found Alfred propped up in bed and looking like he was in good spirits. "Grandpa, Dr. Jarvis is here," Jonathan announced as he led Roxanne to the bed. After hearing that, Alfred peered at Roxanne with a grateful smile. "Dr. Jarvis, thank you so much for treating me. If it weren't for you, I wouldn't still be alive today." Alfred had seen Roxanne during the previous treatments, but he had been so weak that he could barely talk. Now that he had recuperated for a couple of days, he finally found the energy to thank the latter personally. "Don't mention it, old Mr. Queen," Roxanne replied with a polite. Roxanne had only just stepped into the house when her brows furrowed at the person sitting on the couch. "We meet again, Ms. Jarvis," Aubrey piped up. Even though she was wearing a smile, there was no hiding the cold glint in her eyes. "Smile. After all, I'm a doctor, and you're my patient. I feel just as happy and accomplished to see you on the road to recovery." Without further ado, she sat by the bed and began sterilizing her tools. Seeing how focused she was, Alfred's appreciation for her instantly grew beyond words. Of course, Aubrey was upset at Alfred's reaction and quickly walked up to him to block his view of Roxanne. "Hello, old Mr. Queen." Alfred finally noticed Aubrey's presence and nodded at her. "Oh, Aubrey, you're here too. When I heard that you've woken up, I really wanted to visit you sooner," Aubrey said as she sat beside Alfred. But I've been so busy at work that I couldn't find the time to drop by. Thankfully, I managed to free up my schedule today, so I rushed here immediately." The next second, Aubrey glanced at Roxanne and added, "Lucian was supposed to come too, but he's swamped with work and told me to send you his regards. We're all just relieved to know that you've gotten better." Alfred beamed with gratitude. "You and Lucian are good kids. You're both busy with work, yet you still put in so much effort to find me a doctor. There's no need to stand on ceremony with us, old Mr. Queen," Aubrey lightly chided. "You're like a grandfather to Lucian and me. It's only right that we do everything we can for you." Even as she was talking, Aubrey's gaze lingered on Roxanne, her eyes full of pride and conceit. It was evident from the conversation that Alfred had already regarded Aubrey and Lucian as a family. Rationally speaking, Roxanne knew their relationship had nothing to do with her. However, for some inexplicable reason, she just couldn't shrug off the strange feeling inside her. After sterilizing all her tools, Roxanne tamped down her emotions and walked toward Alfred and Aubrey. "Please step aside, Ms. Pearson. I'm going to start the treatment now." Aubrey was still happily chatting away with Alfred when Roxanne's voice had the latter turning his attention back to her. Left with no other choice, Aubrey slowly put her smile away and stepped back with her teeth gritted. By the time the treatment was over, Frida had also returned home. Upon finding out from the butler that Roxanne was treating Alfred, she made a beeline for the latter's bedroom. "Grandpa, how are you feeling?" Frida asked concernedly the moment she stepped into the room. Alfred nodded slightly. "Much better." Having lived for so long, he had gained an understanding of how traditional medicine worked and had also consulted countless famous doctors. Roxanne, however, had come as a delightful surprise to him. After each course of her treatment, Alfred would always feel a significant improvement in his health, which was something that not even the best doctors in the world could achieve. As Frida looked her grandfather over and finally nodded with a smile. "That's good to hear." Then, she turned to Aubrey and added, "Have you come to visit Grandpa too, Aubrey? Since it's getting late, why don't you stay for dinner?" Naturally, Aubrey had no objections to that and grinned broadly. "In that case, don't mind if I stay and bother you, old Mr. Queen." Alfred merely chuckled and nodded. Now that Frida was home, Roxanne hastened her packing, not wanting to stay and interact with the women any further. Just then, Alfred smiled and turned to her. "Dr. Jarvis, why don't you stay for dinner too? I could use this opportunity to thank you properly." Roxanne froze momentarily and was racking her brain for an excuse when Alfred continued, "Invite Lucian over too. It'd be great to gather everyone for a hearty meal. We can treat it as a celebration of my recovery, can't we? Besides, it's been a while since I had any fun." Needless to say, Jonathan acceded to his grandfather's request and immediately left the room to call Lucian. That, however, made Roxanne's heart skip a beat. After packing her tools back into the medical box, she hurriedly stood up and bid farewell to Alfred. "Since it's a family dinner, I don't think it'd be appropriate for me to join. If you really must thank me, we can always find another day for it, old Mr. Queen." Although Roxanne had met Lucian plenty of times since she returned from overseas and was also acutely aware of his relationship with Aubrey, She truly loathed the thought of seeing them together. In fact, the mental image of them sitting next to each other was enough to make her feel ill at ease. Therefore, it was no surprise that she was in a hurry to leave. It was apparent that Roxanne was reluctant to stay, and it didn't take long for Frida to figure out why. "But you're my grandfather's lifesaver, Dr. Jarvis. Let's dispense with the formalities, shall we?" Frida said as her lips curled into a sardonic smile. "Moreover, this is Grandpa's way of showing his appreciation. Join us for dinner if you have nothing on later." Realizing that Frida was up to no good, Roxanne's brows creased slightly. Jonathan had just gotten off the phone when he overheard Frida's words. Thinking that his sister was merely trying to be a good host, he chimed in, "Lucian will be coming over in a bit. You've met him before. I'm sure he'd like some updates on Grandpa's recovery, so it'd be good if you could stay to help answer his questions." Since she couldn't bring herself to say no to that, Roxanne could only nod in agreement. Frida walked up to hold Aubrey's arm while giving Roxanne a mocking gaze. Well, well, well. I can't believe the doctor really has the guts to stay." As it turned out, Frida only asked Roxanne to stay because Alfred had invited Lucian, and she wanted nothing more than to mess with the doctor. Given Roxanne's relationship with Lucian, I wonder how she'd react when she sees him with other women. "Oh, I can't wait to find out." Before the group headed downstairs, Alfred asked Roxanne if he could get out of bed in his condition. As soon as he got the green light, he let Jonathan and the butler hold him and slowly made his way down the stairs. Roxanne kept her head hung low as she sat at the dining table, trying her best to make herself less visible. Unfortunately, Frida seemed to want to make things difficult by intentionally firing questions at Aubrey and her every so often. On account of Alfred, Roxanne answered them all. A while later, the butler's voice rang out from the door. "Mr. Farwell ARV then." Everyone heard Lucian give a brief response in his deep voice before seeing his tall and lean figure appear in front of them. "Hello, old Mr. Queen," Lucian greeted, his gaze slowly sweeping around the room. When his eyes fell on Roxanne, he couldn't help but pause a moment. Roxanne dug her nails into her palms as she held his gaze and nodded at him calmly. Without further ado, Lucian raised his brows and responded with a small smile. "Take a seat, Lucian. Aubrey's been waiting for you for almost half a day," Frida said warmly, beckoning for him to sit beside Aubrey. Earlier, she had used the excuse of her grandfather wanting to thank Roxanne to get the latter to sit in front of Alfred while she and Jonathan plopped themselves down beside the doctor. As such, the only seat left was the one next to Aubrey. However, knowing that Lucian had a closer relationship with Alfred than she did, Aubrey immediately stood up and gave her seat to him. That way, Lucian was now beside Alfred and also directly opposite Roxanne. Upon seeing him sit facing her, Roxanne felt herself tensing up as she slowly lowered her gaze. When dinner started, she quietly tucked into her meal and only spoke when Alfred talked to her. As for Aubrey, she was more concerned about Lucian's attitude toward Roxanne than anything else. Even when she was getting food for Alfred, she'd check Lucian's line of sight and frequently talk to him so he wouldn't focus too much on Roxanne. Of course, Roxanne was unaware of Aubrey's motives. All she knew was that their conversation really made them seem like a family, and she couldn't shake off the uncomfortable feeling stirring inside her. Frida glanced at Roxanne and was surprised to see her still so calm and composed. Hence, she turned to Aubrey and said with a lilt to her voice. Aubrey, you and Lucian look so much in love. Have you picked a date for your wedding yet? I'm still waiting to be your bridesmaid. As soon as those words were out, Roxanne froze in her tracks. Hey? What did she mean by that? Are Lucian and Aubrey not married yet? Aubrey, too, felt her smile freezing in place. After all, she hadn't expected Frida to bring up the wedding right there and then. Just as she began thinking about how best to change the topic, she felt Alfred's concerned gaze on them. That's right. The two of you have been together for so many years. Even Estella has grown up too. Isn't it time to settle down? Yes, you guys should have gotten married a long time ago. I don't even know why you've dragged it on until now, Jonathan teased. For a moment, everyone had their eyes on Lucian as they waited for his response. However, instead of replying immediately, he merely shot a quick look at Thuoman opposite him. Even though it was a brief moment, it hadn't gone unnoticed by those at the dining table. Aubrey hadn't taken her eyes off Lucian, so when she saw him glancing at Roxanne for the marriage question, she began to burn with envy. There's no need to rush the wedding, Lucian replied, still staring at Roxanne. Ha! Let's see if she can still be so calm after this. Although Roxanne was taken aback momentarily by Lucian's reply, it didn't take long for her to regain her composure. So what if they aren't married yet? It's only a matter of time before they do. Why should I be surprised? With that, Roxanne lowered her gaze and casually resumed eating. It was as though the earlier interaction had absolutely nothing to do with her. Aubrey, on the other hand, found Lucian's reply rather surprising. How weird. When I last spoke to Lucian about the wedding, he already hinted at wanting to call it off. Why would he change his mind now? Alfred frowned, clearly unhappy with Lucian's reply. However, before he could say anything more, Aubrey hastily said, Lucian's right. In any case, I won't be running off anytime. There's no need to rush, old Mr. Queen. We're doing just fine, aren't we? Besides, it hasn't been easy for Lucian to find time to visit you, so let's not talk about us. We should be talking about happier things. If we drag this topic on any longer, I'm afraid Lucian might turn the tables and reveal his intention to end our engagement. How can I risk letting him say that in front of Roxanne? I'd be so humiliated if he did. Once again, the eagle-eyed Jonathan noticed Aubrey's reluctance to talk about the wedding and chimed in, That's Lucian for you. He loves his job more than anything else. Leave them be, Grandpa. I'm sure Lucian has his plans. I don't deny that work is important, but it isn't right to keep putting off the wedding, is it? Alfred grumbled. It's been so many years, yet Estella still. Roxanne clenched her fists and managed to suppress her doubts before lifting her gaze to meet Lucian's. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, and Lucian noticed the indifference on Roxanne's face. He furrowed his brows, a trace of displeasure in his heart. Doesn't have a mother to look after her. I don't know what you guys are thinking, but I know my heart aches for her. Flustered, Aubrey gave a brief and vague response. As soon as she thought about Estella, Roxanne, too, felt a little heartbroken. Ah, no wonder the kid's always clinging to me. It's because she doesn't have a mother. Just as she became lost in her thoughts, she suddenly heard Alfred calling her. What about you, Dr. Jarvis? Are you married? Roxanne snapped out of her daze and replied after a moment of stunned silence, no. Not yet. Alfred looked her up and down and curled his lips into a satisfied smile. What do you think about Jonathan? Would you like to consider him? After several treatments, Alfred had long developed an admiration for Roxanne. It would, without a doubt, be even better if she could join their family as his granddaughter-in-law. Caught off guard by the question, Roxanne stared back at Alfred, open-mouthed and speechless. Frida shot a disgusted glance at Roxanne and scoffed, "Stop trying to play matchmaker, Grandpa. No matter how capable Dr. Jarvis is, it still won't change the fact that she already has children. As far as I know, they aren't very young either. Given my brother's caliber, how can you tell him to marry a divorcee with kids? You may approve of it, but I won't. Not ever." "Is that so?" "Well, I never knew that," Alfred muttered, genuinely surprised. "Yes, I've been divorced once. I don't think I'd be good enough for Mr. Queen." Hearing that, Alfred drew his brows together disapprovingly. "So what if you're a divorcee? Given your talents, I'm sure you have no lack of suitors. What's this nonsense about not being good enough? If the two of you do fall in love, I'll be the first to give my stamp of approval." Touched by Alfred's enthusiasm, Roxanne chuckled. "Thank you for thinking so highly of me, old Mr. Queen. Unfortunately, I don't think Mr. Queen and I are suited for each other. Don't worry. I'll continue to keep an eye out for a suitable man." "Yes. It must be tough being a single mother. Get married once you've found a suitable partner," Alfred said with a nod. Roxanne, too, bobbed her head in agreement. As Lucian watched Alfred and Roxanne enjoying their chat, his gaze gradually darkened. After dinner, Alfred returned to his room to rest. Roxanne followed him to give him one final checkup before heading downstairs to bid her goodbye. "It's so late now. Let me give you a lift home," Jonathan piped up. "No, it's fine," Roxanne replied with a smile. "You still have guests to entertain." Jonathan knew she was right and decided not to insist further. "In that case, please be careful on your way home. Oh, by the way, I hope you won't take my grandfather's words to heart. At his age, he tends to worry about things like that." Roxanne merely smiled and turned to leave. "It's getting late, and I still have work to do. I think I'll be taking my leave now," Lucian suddenly said when he saw Roxanne walking out of the mansion. Aubrey, who had become very wary, decided to follow suit. "Oh, I'm also thinking about leaving. Let's go together, then." "No. It's not like we're taking the same routes." "I'll be going now," Lucian answered indifferently, striding off before Aubrey could say anything else. As she watched him walk away, Aubrey stood in a daze, her face frozen with shock. Jonathan, too, could help but furrow his brows. Since dinner started, he could already feel something was wrong between Lucian and the two women, but unfortunately, he could put his finger on it. "Aubrey." Frida mumbled, baffled at how stunned her friend was. Thankfully, Aubrey was brought back to her senses and quickly forced out a smile. Well, I still have work to do, so I won't bother you guys anymore. Even though Jonathan and Frida could tell that something was amiss with Aubrey, they refrained from asking any more questions. After exchanging a few more words, they eventually saw her off. Once they were back in the mansion, Jonathan immediately turned to his sister. "Hey, how did you know that Dr. Jarvis has kids?" Frida pursed her lips. "I saw them when I was out for lunch with Aubrey." "Oh, I also know that she's Lucian's ex-wife. I can't believe she had the gall to come back." Upon hearing that, Jonathan was momentarily shocked before realization dawned on him. No wonder I had the nagging feeling that there was some awkwardness between Dr. Jarms and Lucian. She's the woman from 6 years ago. Even after leaving the mansion and getting into her car, Roxanne still felt pretty unsettled from the conversations at the dining table. She took a moment to collect her thoughts and only started the car when she had calmed herself down. All of a sudden, someone rapped on the window. Roxanne whipped her head around in the direction of the sound, but when she saw who it was, she looked away and pretended not to have heard anything. Alas, the person outside knocked on the window again, going so far as to bend down to peer into the car. Even though Roxanne knew no one could see her from the outside, she couldn't help but tense up. After some hesitation, she finally gave in and rolled down the window. "What is it?" As it turned out, Lucian had been the one standing beside the car. When he heard Roxanne's voice, he calmly raised his brows. "I did drive here today. Mind giving me a lift if it's convenient for you?" With that, he reached a hand out for the car door. Unfortunately, before Roxanne could even get her bearings, Lucian had already entered the car and settled into the passenger seat. He promptly fastened his seatbelt and added, "Let's go." Roxanne finally came to her senses, but she was anything but pleased. "Where's your chauffeur? It's already so late. Since I can easily get a ride, why should I trouble him to come all the way here?" Those words rendered Roxanne speechless, and it took a while before she blurted out. "If I remember correctly, Ms. Pearson has left either. I think she'd be happy to give you a lift." Join our Facebook and WhatsApp group for more updates, link is given in description. Rest audiobook will be continued in next episode.